Alright, you guys, we are going to talk about war crimes and specifically prisoners of war. Alright, so how pervasive is this problem? Pervasive basically means how spread out is it, or is it spread out enough to feel like it's happening everywhere? With prisoners of war, it's extremely pervasive. It happens everywhere. It's found in all states. Is it a new thing, or has it been happening for centuries? This war crime has been happening for centuries. It's been a thing since warfare began to develop. Here I have a picture of a Chicago map showing some of the prisoners of war camps in Chicago. Alright, so we're going to get into a little history of the prisoners of war crime. I have covered 3 eras to kind of demonstrate how it's developed over the centuries. So with primitive times, the captured warriors were considered property of the captor, and they were often forced into slavery with little or no pay. They worked in unsanitary and unsafe environments. They were often given no food or water for days, so they were treated pretty poorly during these times. With Middle Ages, the concept of ransom was developed, and it became beneficial for warriors to capture wealthy soldiers. Essentially, this was a time to determine whether a prisoner of war was going to be beneficial to their capture or not. So with that, holding prisoners required expensive upkeep. So prisoners were not kept unless it was beneficial to their captor, and soldiers of little status were killed. So basically, if you had no money or you weren't wealthy enough, you were deemed unbeneficial, and you were killed or expelled. In the 17th and 18th century, the modern thinking of prisoners of war was developed. So essentially, individual soldiers were enemies only so long as they were armed, and captors' only rights over prisoners was to keep them from returning to the battlefield. So in this sense, it kind of shifted a little bit for the prisoners of war. It resulted in more humane treatment of those officially classified as prisoners of war. So yeah. Alright, so what are prisoners of war, and what does it take to be classified as a prisoner of war? So prisoner of war, they're basically any person captured or interned by a belligerent during war. I had a problem with the belligerent definition, so I looked it up, and it basically means a state at war that is protected by and subject to the laws of war. So with that comes the treatment of prisoners of war. They lack food or shelter, lack access to mail, they lack access to health care, they're often forced into labor, physical mistreatment, torture, extrajudicial executions, and group punishment. With extrajudicial executions, they're designing the deliberate killing of an individual by a state agent without the lawful authority granted by a judicial proceeding. So here on the left-hand side, I have an Indian prisoner of war. This is just an example of what they look like. Most of the time, they're malnourished, they suffer from starvation, they don't get food or water. So yeah. Alright, so there has been a couple of treaties that were created to control or prohibit prisoners of war. I've listed the 2 here, including some examples. Not all of them are put in this PowerPoint just because it would take forever to get through. So with the Hague Convention 1, that was basically a series of treaties that was created, and it was among the first formal statements of the laws to address war crimes. So basically it didn't just cover the prisoners of war, it covered all of the war crimes that have been conducted over the years. And now I've listed 2 of the articles here in this presentation and then kind of thrown the rest in there. There's about 16 or 17 other articles that specifically speak about the prisoners of war, but just to save some time and space, I have just listed the 2 of them. So with the 2 that I've covered, we have Article 4, which is the prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of individuals or of corps who captured them. So with this article, all of their personal belongings except arms, horses, and military papers, they remain their property. So they get to keep a little bit of individuality here and self, and they get to keep some of their items to themselves and their names, which is nice. With Article 6, the state may be utilized the labors of prisoners of war according to their rank and amplitude. So with this article, Prisoners may be authorized to work for the public service, and prisoners that do any work for the state are paid at this point, so it's not a sense of forced labor here. They're getting paid and justifiably getting money for their work. Now, with the Third Geneva Convention, this provides a wide range of protection for prisoners of war. It's more self-centered towards prisoners of war. I've listed some of the essential points of this convention and the treaty in itself. So with that, the status of prisoners of war is only applied in international armed conflict. Powers of prisoners of war can not be prosecuted for taking direct part in hostilities. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely in all circumstances. This also included making sure they had access to medical care, food, water, shelter, mail, all of the good things that was taken from them before in the history slide that I talked about. So why were these treaties enacted in the first place? Just like all treaties enacted for war crimes, this treaty was enacted to regulate the armed conflict and seek to limit these effects. Okay, so Ukraine and Russia are parties of the Third Geneva Convention. They both have signed the treaties. They both understand the guidelines of what they can and can't do with their prisoners of war. So there were violations in the Russia and Ukraine conflict. With Russia, they violated these treaties with their Ukraine prisoners of war. Some were being or had personal belongings pillaged, often transported in overcrowded buses, and sometimes left water or toilets for more than a day. This can be extremely inhumane. Admission procedures, which were basically procedures that happened as soon as they were captured. These consisted of prolonged beatings, dog attacks, being stripped and put in distressed positions for long periods of time. Often women were beaten and threatened with sexual violence as well. Now, with Ukraine's violations, with their Russian prisoners of war reported being transported in humiliating conditions, which essentially was them being stripped naked with their hands tied behind their back, face and mouth covered, for the entire duration of their trip. Now here I have put a picture of a prisoner cellar in Ukraine. With creating regulations or prohibitions against war crimes, there comes problems with enforcing them. So those can be the fact that there's no world government. With no world government, that means there's no judicial branch to punish war crimes. Also, it occurs in more than one place, which means there are multiple offenders, which makes the chances of being caught, arrested, tried, and convicted of a war crime so minimal that there is no real deterrent effects. So essentially, this wraps up the PowerPoint. I thank you guys for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.